On most maps, the Arctic looks like a blank white cap, quiet, distant, almost frozen in time. But the line that defines it, the Arctic Circle at about 66 to 34 sig north, is less a border than a warning light cross it and the sun can refuse to set, or refuse to rise. Silence. And while that strange daylight still feels eternal, the ice does not. Satellites show the September sea ice minimum shrinking about 12.2% per decade, and Greenland has been losing on the order of 264 gigatons of ice per year. A slow, relentless hemorrhage into the ocean. What happens when the planet's coldest shield starts to thin? And who is forced to live inside that change? The Arctic is not a single country, not even a single landscape. It is a system, a cap of ocean, and fractured continents arranged around the North Pole, stitched together by cold darkness and a sun that behaves differently here. The Arctic Circle, about 66 to 34 north, is the simplest line humans have drawn to describe it. Because above that latitude, the rules of daylight can break the midnight sun in summer, the long polar night in winter. But the Arctic's true borders are not on maps. They are written in ice in wind, and in the slow architecture of the Earth. Start with the stage itself, the Arctic Ocean, a basin surrounded by North America, Greenland, and Eurasia. Beneath its surface, the seafloor is not flat and quiet. A long submarine spine, the Lomonosov Ridge, stretches across the ocean, made of continental crust and acting like a geological divider between major basins. It is one of those hidden features that changes how scientists talk about the Arctic, not as empty water, but as a place with deep structure and long memory. And then there is the Gackle Ridge, a mid-ocean ridge under the Arctic Ocean, and the slowest spreading ridge known opening at less than a centimeter a year. That is tectonics at an almost unbearable pace, the planet's crust quietly pulling apart in near silence, while above it the ice can shift in a single storm. On the edges of this basin, the Arctic is built from shelves, islands, and coastlines that look solid until the camera lingers long enough to notice the ground is not stable. Much of the far north sits on permafrost ground that remains frozen for at least 2 consecutive years, and it is estimated to underlie about 24% of the northern hemisphere's land surface. In practical terms, that means entire towns' roads, airstrips, and pipelines have been anchored to a foundation that was never meant to soften. The Arctic also carries the signature of the last great sculptor, ice. roughly 26,000 to 20,000 years ago. During the last glacial maximum, vast ice sheets pressed down on northern lands. Their weight reshaped valleys, ground mountains, and helped carve the U-shaped forms that still define polar coastlines. When the climate warmed and the ice retreated, the sea flooded the deepened valleys, one of the key steps in the making of fjords, those narrow, steep-walled inlets that look like the earth has been sliced open. In places such as Svalbard and Greenland's coasts, the landscape still reads like a glacial diary, hanging valleys, sharp ridgelines, and fjords that feel less scenic and more like evidence proof that ice once behaved like a moving blade. Yet even after glaciers withdraw, the Earth does not simply relax and return to normal. Land that was once pressed down by kilometers of ice can rise again post-glacial rebound, a slow exhale of the crust that continues for thousands of years. In parts of northern Europe, modern uplift rates can reach on the order of 10 meters per year, subtly rewriting shorelines within a human lifetime. The Arctic, in other words, is not merely shaped by change. It is shaped by aftershocks. Above all of this geology sits the Arctic's most cinematic force, the coupling of light ice and heat. Because sea ice is bright, it reflects sunlight back into space. When it thins or retreats, darker, ocean water absorbs more energy. One reason the region has experienced Arctic amplification, with research finding that large portions of the Arctic Ocean warmed at least 4 times as fast as the global average over recent decades. The planet's white shield is not decoration. It is part of the climate engine. And the sea ice is not a single sheet. It is a shifting, cracking skin that grows and shrinks with seasons. NASA's long-running satellite record shows that September Arctic sea ice, the annual minimum, has been shrinking at about 12.2% per decade relative to the 1981-2010 average. That is a geological scale transformation happening on a timescale a single generation can witness. Even the ocean currents carry the Arctic's fingerprints outward. The Beaufort Gyre, for example, is often described as the largest reservoir of liquid freshwater in the Arctic Ocean, an immense wind-driven storage system that can influence how freshwater is released toward the North Atlantic. The Arctic is not isolated. It is connected by moving water, by shifting winds, by consequences that travel. So, what is the Arctic really? a circle on a map, or a living boundary where tectonics, ice ages, and modern warming all overlap in the same frame. If the ground is still rebounding, the ocean still circulating, and the ice still thinning, what in this place can honestly be called stable? From above, the Arctic can look like negative space white empty, almost abstract. But that emptiness is an illusion created by distance. Up close, the region is loud, with life just quiet, in the way a winter forest is quiet, not dead, just saving energy. The Arctic's biodiversity is built on a paradox. The season is short, the light is extreme, the cold is ruthless. And yet when conditions align, when the sun returns and the sea ice begins to loosen its grip, an entire food web surges into motion. Not slowly, not politely. It blooms like a secret that cannot be contained. The foundation is microscopic. Marine algae phytoplankton in the open water and algae associated with sea ice perform the basic miracle that everything else depends on turning light into living matter. No AA describes Arctic marine primary productivity as the foundation of the marine food web, and stresses how sensitive it is to sea ice cover, ocean temperature, and nutrient supply, all changing as the Arctic warms. Sea ice is not merely a lid, it is structure. It shapes where light reaches, where nutrients mix, and where early season growth can occur. Studies of Arctic systems repeatedly highlight that both phytoplankton and sea ice algae contribute to primary production and feed the broader food web. That first link, algae feeds the next zooplankton, the drifting animals of the water column. High-fat meals matter here. In a world where survival often means storing energy for later quality is not a luxury, it is biology. One clear, accessible way to say it, ice algae help form the basis of the Arctic marine food web by converting sunlight into sugars that move upward through zooplankton fish seals and eventually polar bears. Then come the fish, the middle, the hinge. In many Arctic seas, Arctic cod, polar cod, Boreagotus sida, functions like a vital currency in the ecosystem, a nutrient-rich prey fish that supports seabirds and marine mammals, especially seals. The Arctic Council's Marine Biodiversity Assessment notes that warming and northward shifts of boreal species, like Atlantic cod, can increase predation pressure on polar cod, stressing a key prey base. Above the fish are the animals. People recognize instantly the ones that seem to own the Arctic in the public imagination, because they depend on the ice in visible, dramatic ways. Sea ice is a platform for life. NSIDC explains it plainly. sea ice provides resting and birthing places for seals and walrus, and it is a hunting and breeding ground for polar bears. When ice is scarce, or conditions are poor, it can stress marine mammals and affect their ability to reproduce. For ringed seals, snow and ice are not scenery. They are shelter. Some assessments highlight how female ringed seals give birth in snow dens on sea ice. The snow cover helps protect pups from cold and predators during the nursing season. For polar bears, the dependency is even more direct. The U.S. Geological Survey describes polar bears as relying on sea ice as a platform to hunt seals, their primary food. When the ice retreats, the distance between predator and prey becomes a gap measured not just in miles, but in missed meals, lost body mass, and failing reproduction. And for walrus, ice can mean the difference between rest and risk. When sea ice pulls away from feeding grounds, walrus may be forced into long swims and crowded coastal haulouts where disturbances can lead to dangerous stampedes. Conservation reporting has described walrus needing to swim long distances from coastal haulouts to reach benthic feeding areas in places like the Chukchi. Recent U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service work also emphasizes community-linked monitoring and protection of coastal haul-out areas because the shoreline is becoming a more frequent replacement for disappearing summer ice in some regions. The Arctic's biodiversity is not only marine. On land, the tundra looks spare low plants, huge sky, but it contains its own intricate web of specialists, and it is changing in ways that ripple into human lives. CAF, the Arctic Council Working Group, focused on Arctic flora and fauna tracks mammals as part of Arctic biodiversity monitoring. Their reporting includes caribou, reindeer, muskoxen, lemmings, and predators like the Arctic fox, a reminder that Arctic life is not a single iconic species, but an ensemble cast. Caribou and reindeer in particular are a lifeline species across many northern landscapes, ecologically and culturally. The Arctic Council's State of the Arctic Terrestrial Biodiversity Report notes that circumpolar caribou reindeer populations have declined since the 1990s, in some cases dramatically, with notable exceptions. Climate doesn't have to warm dramatically to become dangerous. Sometimes it becomes dangerous by becoming unpredictable. The Arctic Biodiversity Assessment notes that increased winter rain and thaw events can create ice layers on the ground or within snowpack, making it harder for animals like caribou, Shao reindeer, and muskoxen to reach food, and in severe cases, contributing to die-offs. That is the Arctic's terrestrial story in miniature, a place where a few degrees, a few days of rain in the wrong season can rewrite survival rules that used to hold steady. And the birds turn the tundra into a runway. When summer arrives, enormous migrations deliver sound back to the landscape calls, wing beats, nesting noise, because the Arctic is not only a home. It is also a seasonal nursery for wildlife that spends the rest of the year elsewhere. In the full script, this is where the camera can linger on one bird cliff or wetland hotspot, because the density of life is almost shocking against the vastness. The question that ties sea and land together is timing. Productivity in Arctic seas depends strongly on the seasonal rhythm of sea ice retreat and the availability of light and nutrients. NOAA emphasizes that the biological engine of marine algae is highly sensitive to these changing conditions. As sea ice changes, the entire schedule of life can shift. When food appears, where it appears, how long it lasts. And in a place where many species survive on a narrow seasonal window, a shifted schedule can become a silent crisis. The chicks hatch after the peak food. Pulse the seals pup. When the snow cover is thinner, the fish move north, while predators lag behind. Arctic biodiversity is often described as resilient. It is. It has to be. But resilience is not invincibility. Even CAF's policy-facing summaries emphasize that Arctic biodiversity is being degraded and that decisive action matters. So the Arctic is not a frozen desert. It is a living network built on ice sunlight and timing an ecosystem that turns a short season into a burst of abundance, then asks every creature to endure the long dark. But if the ice is changing faster than bodies and traditions can adapt, what happens to a food web when its foundation becomes unreliable? Long before the Arctic became a headline, before satellites traced the ice edge like a heartbeat, people were already here, living inside the wind, not visiting, not surviving for a season, building lives that could hold together through darkness, scarcity, and cold so sharp it can feel like the air itself is solid. Archaeology tells this story in layers like snowdrifts settling over time. Some of the earliest known cultures in Greenland belong to the wider Paleo-Inuit world groups, often associated with early migrations into the high Arctic. Among them were the Sakak culture in southern Greenland, often dated roughly 2500-800 BCE, and the Independence Y culture in northern Greenland, commonly placed around 2400-1900 BCE, with scholarly debate on exact end dates. These were not empires. They were small, adaptable communities, moving with the logic of ice and animals arriving, learning, and sometimes disappearing, leaving only stone bone and the shape of campsites behind. Then came other cultural horizons across the Eastern Arctic, including what is widely known as the Dorset tradition, a Paleo-Inuit culture commonly dated from roughly 500 BCE to 1500 CE, with regional timelines that scholars break into early, middle, and late phases. Dorset sites and artifacts show a world of skilled hunters and distinctive tool-making, and their story becomes even more haunting, because eventually, the Dorset disappear from the record. By around the second millennium, a new wave of people and technology begins to spread across the Arctic shores. That later wave is often connected to what archaeologists call the Thule tradition ancestors of many modern Inuit communities. Sources commonly describe Thule development in coastal Alaska by around 1000 CE, followed by a rapid eastward expansion across northern Canada and into Greenland by around the 13th century. It is one of the most dramatic human movements in the circumpolar world, not because it was easy, but because it was so logistically demanding. And here is where the Arctic reveals its first hard truth about culture in the far north. Technology is not progress. It is permission. Permission to travel. Permission to hunt. Permission to stay alive long enough for song's kinship and memory to matter. The Thule expansion is often linked to innovations that made Arctic distance feel smaller, dog sled travel, and sophisticated skin boats, including the Umiak, an open skin-covered boat used to move people and supplies, and to hunt large marine mammals. Museum and reference sources describe how these transportation advances supported wide movement and seasonal life along the coasts. The Umiak itself is more than a vessel. It is a floating statement of community, a boat built not only to move a hunter, but to move a family, a camp of future. Encyclopedic references note that Umiaks were traditionally used to carry people and possessions to seasonal hunting grounds and were important for hunts such as whaling, with construction typically using skins over a frame of available materials. And on land, especially when a world turns white and the sea hardens at the edges, there is the dog team, a moving engine in a place where engines freeze. Historical and museum accounts often connect dog teams and sleds to the ability to follow migrations, haul supplies, and link distant camps into a network that could trade, share knowledge, and survive. But if movement is one pillar of Arctic culture, warmth is another. Not warmth as comfort, warmth as civilization. One of the most iconic objects in Inuit life is the quillik, the traditional oil lamp used by many circumpolar peoples. References describe it as a soapstone lamp, fueled by seal oil or blubber, an object that provided light and heat in a landscape with little burnable wood, and a centerpiece of domestic life in winter dwellings. It is difficult to overstate what that means. A single flame, tended carefully, holding back a darkness that lasts for months. This is where the Arctic begins to feel less like history and more like intimacy. A lamp is not a headline. It is hands. It is routine. It is the quiet work of keeping children alive in a world that offers no shortcuts. And the questions start to sharpen. If survival requires such precision, what does that do to a people's sense of time? When the sun disappears, what becomes the calendar? In many Arctic societies, the answer is not a date. It is observation, snow texture, wind direction, animal behavior. The Arctic teaches that nature is not background, it is information, and culture is the method for reading it. Early Arctic life was also spiritual in a way that is deeply practical. When food can vanish behind a storm, belief is not only about meaning, it is about relationship. In Inuit and Yupik traditions, historical accounts describe the role of ritual specialists, often known as angakut, singular angakok figures associated with healing and mediation between humans and the spirit world, sometimes described through trance-based journeys connected to securing success in hunting and restoring balance after taboos are broken. In a landscape where animals are life itself, spiritual systems frequently revolve around respect, restraint, and the idea that the world must be treated as a partner, not a resource. This is not a romantic detail. It is a survival ethic. Even archaeology hints at how carefully northern cultures organize life around the essentials. Dorset artifacts, for example, are often described as including specialized tools and distinctive art objects. Different sources highlight their long presence across the eastern Arctic and their eventual disappearance before or during the period when Thule communities became widespread. And then comes the Thule story, again this time, not as a migration, but as a transformation of how humans could inhabit the Arctic. Museum sources emphasize a rapid expansion, helped by dog sleds and skin-covered umiaks, allowing travel in larger numbers, and supporting a coastal life that could follow whales and seals across immense distances. What makes this chapter powerful on camera is the scale of it. The Arctic is vast to modern tourists with GPS and heated shelters. Imagine it without those things. Imagine moving entire households across sea ice and storm coastlines year after year and still carrying stories strong enough to outlive the journey. And that is the thread that should never be lost. Arctic culture is not only old, it is deep. It is deep in the sense that it was built by repeated decisions made under pressure: where to camp when the wind shifts, when to travel before the ice becomes unsafe, how to share food so the community survives the season, not just the strongest hunter. This is also where the documentary's human heartbeat can start to appear, not as a single character, but as a collective presence. A community watching the sky the way cities watch clocks. A child learning to recognize danger in the sound of ice. An elder naming places not as coordinates, but as memory. This inlet, this ridge, this current, a geography made personal. And now, a question that opens the door to the next chapter. If the Arctic has always demanded adaptation, what happens when the environment changes faster than knowledge can be passed down? That question belongs partly to history, because Arctic history is full of encounters, waves of newcomers, traders, explorers, and empires trying to translate the North into maps, routes, and profit. It belongs partly to the present too, because the Arctic still has living voices, insisting that this place is not empty land. It is homeland. Modern organizations such as the Inuit Circumpolar Council, ICC, founded in 1977 and representing approximately 180,000 Inuit across Alaska, Canada, Greenland, and Chukotka, exist because the story did not end in archaeology. It continued, it adapted, and it demanded to be heard on the world stage. So when the Arctic is described as a frontier, it misses the point. A frontier suggests nobody lived there before the outsiders arrived. The Arctic has always had nations of knowledge, people who learned to read a world of ice the way others read roads. And that leads directly into the next chapter, the moment the outside world arrived in 4 ships. Flags trade obsession, and the Arctic became not just a home, but a prize. For the people who have always lived in the Arctic, the far north was never a blank space. It was a home with rules, ice, as road wind, as forecast animals, as calendar. But for outsiders, the Arctic often became something else, a problem to solve, a passage to force open, a frontier to claim. That transformation begins earlier than most expect on the southern edges of the Arctic world, where the North Atlantic turns harsh and the map becomes a test of nerve. Around 985 CE, Norse settlers led by Eric the Red established the first European settlement in Greenland. It was not a casual visit. It was an attempt to build permanence on the edge of the ice to farm narrow fjord valleys and hunt northern seas. In many ways, Greenland became an early Arctic outpost, an experiment in how far European life could stretch before climate distance and isolation pushed back. From there, the Arctic's outer rim started to look like possibility. Not warmth, never warmth, but access. Access to walrus ivory, to fish, to seals, to new horizons, to stories that spread faster than ships could sail. And once the Arctic became a place of potential profit, it also became a place of competition. Along the Eurasian North, another Arctic identity formed the world of northern seafarers and traders. One example often mentioned in Arctic history is the Pomor trade, a long-running exchange between northern Russians and northern Norwegians. Grain products moving one way, fish moving the other, binding communities across the Barents region through barter and later regular commerce. These weren't the grand hero voyages of exploration posters. They were something more quietly transformative, everyday Arctic connectivity. A reminder that the Arctic wasn't only a place to conquer, it was a place people already navigated season after season because they had to. And then came the era when empires wanted more than trade. They wanted roots. If a ship could cut through the top of the world, it could rewrite global geography. That dream, an ocean shortcut across the Arctic, became an obsession, especially the search for the Northwest Passage, the fabled sea route linking the Atlantic and Pacific across the Canadian Arctic. The Arctic answered that obsession with one of its most enduring tragedies, Franklin's Lost Expedition. In 1845, Sir John Franklin sailed with HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, aiming to complete the last unnavigated sections of the Northwest Passage. The expedition became icebound, the ships were eventually abandoned, and the entire crew, 129 officers and men, vanished into the Arctic's long silence. For generations, the Franklin story became a legend shaped by grief and speculation. But the Arctic held memory in more than written records. In recent years, Parks Canada and Inuit partners have worked together after the wrecks were discovered, researching and documenting the sites, turning a mystery into a collaboration between modern archaeology and Inuit knowledge of the region. This is one of the Arctic's most important historical lessons. Exploration was never only about brave ships and bold captains. It also depended on who already understood the land and whose warnings were ignored. By the late 19th century, Arctic exploration began to shift in tone. Not just conquest, but science. Not just forcing a route, but learning how the Arctic actually worked. That shift is embodied by Fridtjof Nansen's Fram expedition, 1893-1896, a plan so counterintuitive it sounded like madness, deliberately allow a ship to freeze into the pack ice and drift with it across the Arctic Ocean. The Fram Museum describes how the ship became locked in ice and drifted for years, confirming Nansen's theory about the transpolar drift. In documentary terms, it's an unforgettable image. A ship not fighting the Arctic, but surrendering to its physics, turning the ice into a vehicle. The Arctic can crush wood and steel, but it can also carry you if the strategy is humble enough. And the question changes again. What if the Arctic isn't a wall, but a moving conveyor belt of ice and ocean? In the early 20th century, the Northwest Passage dream finally shifted from myth to reality. Between 1903 and 1906, Roald Amundsen completed the first successful navigation of the Northwest Passage by boat on the Gjöa. The National Maritime Museum RMG notes clearly that Amundsen was the first to do it, and that the voyage lasted from 1903 to 1906. The Fram Museum likewise describes the Gjöa expedition as the first to navigate the passage north of the Canadian mainland in a single expedition and ship. But even this victory comes with an Arctic truth. It took time, pauses, winters, learning. Amundsen's route wasn't a neat line on a map. It was a relationship with a place that sets the schedule. The Arctic does not care about deadlines, only conditions. While explorers chased routes, geopolitics reshaped the Arctic's edges too. In 1867, the United States purchased Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million, ending what many sources describe as Russia's effort to expand trade and settlement across North America's Pacific edge. The U.S. State Department's historical milestone page frames it as a major turning point in American expansion and in Russia's retreat from the region. The U.S. National Archives also summarizes the agreement and the price anchoring the Russian America chapter to a number that still shocks modern audiences because it feels so small for such a vast land. Further east, another legal pillar of the modern Arctic emerged with the Svalbard Treaty, signed 9 February 1920, which recognized Norwegian sovereignty over Svalbard while granting equal commercial access to signatory nations and placing constraints on military use. Norway's Storting Parliament highlights the treaty's signing date entry into force in 1925 and the unique structure of sovereignty with stipulated rights. This is how the Arctic becomes layered not only ice and ecology, but treaties, flags, and the quiet tension between belongs to and accessible by. And then, almost without warning, the Arctic's oldest dream returns with a modern engine shipping. The Northern Sea Route, NSR, runs along Russia's Arctic coast and is often described as about 5,600-kilometer long connecting seas, like the Kara-Laptov East Siberian and Chukchi on the way toward the Bering Strait. Industry-focused summaries describe it as stretching roughly 5,500 kilometers from the Novaya Zemlya area past Siberia to the Bering Strait, noting that thick ice historically blocked it for much of the year, while warming has expanded navigable windows in recent decades. So the Arctic's history is not a straight timeline. It is a loop that keeps tightening early settlement at the margins trade across cold seas, imperial obsession with shortcuts, disasters written into ice scientific drift treaty lines, and now new routes reopening as the climate shifts. And this is the hinge into the modern chapter, because the Arctic is no longer just where history happened. It is where the future is happening first. If new passages open, because the ice retreats, is that a triumph of human navigation or a sign of something breaking? The Arctic has always changed. Ice advances, ice retreats, seas rise, then fall. But what makes the modern era feel different is not that change exists. It's the speed and the sense that multiple systems are shifting at once. Start with the most visible signal, sea ice. NASA's satellite record shows that the Arctic's September sea ice minimum, the end of summer low point, has been shrinking at roughly 12.2% per decade relative to the 1981-2010 average. In practical terms, that means the Arctic Ocean's protective lid is weaker at the very moment the sun and heat are strongest. And research on Arctic amplification has found that parts of the Arctic have been warming at several times the global average, a key reason the region is often described as the planet's early warning zone. Then comes the second headline: the world struggles to truly picture Greenland. Long-term satellite measurements from the GRACE missions show Greenland has been losing ice on the order of hundreds of gigatons per year, a sustained net loss over the modern record. One widely cited estimate puts the average at around 264 gigatons per year over a multi-year period. The number matters because it translates climate into weight, into something that feels physical, not theoretical. But the Arctic's most immediate human crisis is often not on the sea. It's underfoot. Much of the far north is built on permafrost, and scientific summaries note it underlies roughly 24% of the Northern Hemisphere's land area. When permafrost warms and thaws, the ground can settle, shift collapse, turning stable infrastructure into a gamble. The IPCC has described thawing permafrost as a risk multiplier affecting homes, roads, pipelines, and services, and threatening the stability of communities across the Arctic. In documentary terms, this is where the camera stops admiring landscapes and starts noticing details: a tilted house, a buckling road, a water line that breaks more often each year. When the ground itself becomes uncertain, the modern world becomes fragile. And then there is the pressure of attention. The Arctic used to be remote by default. Now it is increasingly accessible, and with access comes tourism, and tourism becomes complicated fast. Cruise ships and expedition tours bring income and jobs, but they also bring fuel, use, emissions, waste management challenges, and sheer foot traffic in places that recover slowly from disturbance. Svalbard is a powerful example. It is marketed as a gateway to polar wildlife and glaciers, and the towns like Longyearbyen sit in landscapes so stark they feel like another planet. Yet Svalbard is also bound by international agreements, like the Svalbard Treaty, signed 1920, in force 1925, and it exists at the center of conversations about climate sovereignty and what sustainable tourism even means in a place where a single footprint can last. In Greenland, too, tourism has grown as the world's curiosity about ice increases. But a place that becomes famous for melting is trapped in a paradox. The very thing drawing visitors is the thing disappearing. The Arctic becomes a museum exhibit that is still alive and still changing. Alongside tourism sits industry, and with it, the old Arctic storyline returns resources. Mining oil and gas development and new shipping routes are increasingly discussed as sea ice retreats. The Northern Sea Route running along Russia's Arctic coast is often described as roughly 5,600 kilometers long, and it is central to debates about Arctic commerce and control. For global shipping, it represents the temptation of shorter distances between Europe and Asia during limited seasonal windows. For ecosystems, it can mean increased noise, higher spill risk and disturbance to marine mammals. For geopolitics, it can mean intensified competition over who governs a sea that used to be blocked by ice. And for Arctic communities, it can mean something even more personal: decisions about their coastlines being made far away. This is why indigenous governance and representation are not optional human interest segments In an Arctic documentary, they are the center of the modern Arctic story. The Inuit Circumpolar Council, ICC, founded in 1977, represents Inuit across Alaska, Canada, Greenland, and Chukotka, and has been a key platform for asserting Inuit rights culture and participation in Arctic policy. When climate shifts and economic interests arrive, the question becomes unavoidable. Who gets to decide what development looks like in a homeland? Even wildlife, the Arctic's global symbol, is now entangled with human choices. Polar bears depend on sea ice for hunting seals, and major scientific agencies emphasize this connection. When the ice retreats and becomes less predictable, the bears face longer fasting periods and more time on land, where they are more likely to encounter people. In some regions, walrus haulouts have become more prominent as summer ice pulls away from feeding grounds, creating crowded coastal gatherings that can be vulnerable to disturbance. So the Arctic's modern challenge is not one challenge. It is a braided cord. Ice retreat reshapes ecosystems and changes marine routes. Permafrost thaw threatens the stability of daily life and infrastructure. Economic opportunity pulls industry north, increasing risk and conflict. Tourism and attention bring money and exposure, but also pressure and footprint. Indigenous rights and knowledge become essential for any future that claims to be fair. And then the Arctic asks its most uncomfortable question, one that doesn't belong to science alone. If the Arctic is changing first, does that make it the world's sacrifice zone or the world's teacher? Because in many places, the Arctic is not asking to be saved as scenery. It is asking to be respected as a living region where people, animals, and cultures are already adapting and already paying costs. What happens when the world treats the top of the planet like a shortcut, a spectacle, or a resource map instead of a home? The Arctic is often described as the end of the world, an empty cap of ice, a final frontier, a faraway white silence. But the truth is stranger and more urgent. The Arctic is not the end. It is the beginning of consequences. Here, a simple change becomes amplified. When sea ice retreats, the ocean absorbs more heat. When the ground that stayed frozen for centuries begins to soften homes, tilt roads crack, and entire communities are forced to rethink what stability means. And when the ecosystem's timing shifts, when the bloom arrives earlier, when the hunting platform thins, animals that evolved for a predictable rhythm are pushed into a new kind of uncertainty. And yet even now, the Arctic is not just a story of loss. It is also a story of knowledge of people who learned to read the language of snow and wind, who built lamps from stone and light from oil, who carried community across sea ice with dogs and boats and memory. The modern Arctic still has living voices insisting that this place is not a blank space for outsiders to redraw. Organizations like the Inuit Circumpolar Council, founded in 1977, exist because the Arctic is home culturally, legally, spiritually, and that reality must be present in every decision about what comes next. So what can be done? Start small, but start real. If travel to the Arctic is part of the dream, choose operators who respect local rules, support community-led initiatives, and minimize footprint, because the Arctic recovers slowly and the impacts last. Seek out indigenous perspectives and research-based information. Support conservation and climate science not only with donations, but with attention. What we watch, share, and demand from leaders shapes what becomes politically possible. And finally, hold the deeper thought in mind. The Arctic is not a distant tragedy. It is a mirror. If the planet's coldest shield can thin within a human lifetime, what else do we think is permanent only because we've never seen it change? On maps, the edge of the world is just a line. In reality, the Arctic is a question one that keeps returning colder and clearer each year. What will we protect, and what will we allow to disappear?